Let's start off with a discussion of what is commonly called Chevron. This precedent comes from the 1984 case Chevron USA versus the National Resources Defense Council, NRDC. The primary holding of the Chevron case is a government agency must conform to any clear legislative statements when interpreting and applying a law. But courts will give the agency deference in ambiguous situations as long as its interpretation is reasonable. The idea seems simple enough. Government agencies must follow any clear legislative statements when they apply a law. However, if there is an ambiguous situation, the courts will defer to the interpretation of the agency as long as it's reasonable. After all, you cannot expect any man-made organization to be able to predict every possible permutation of every situation. So it makes sense if something in the law is ambiguous, capable of being understood in two or more possible senses or ways, somebody has to decide. And technically, there are three possibilities as to who might do that: the courts, the agency, or Congress. Now, since 1984, the courts have deferred to the agency to make such decisions. As is often the case, though, give an agency an inch, they'll take a mile. Such is true with Loper-Bright Enterprises versus Gina Raimondo, Secretary of Commerce. The petitioners, Loper-Bright Enterprises et al., were represented at the Supreme Court by Paul D. Clement. He starts his argument with the specifics of the case.
Commercial fishing is hard. Space on board vessels is tight, and margins are tighter still. Therefore, for my clients, having to carry federal observers on board is a burden, but having to pay their salaries is a crippling blow. Congress recognized as much by strictly limiting the circumstances in which domestic fishing vessels could be saddled with monitoring costs and capping them at 2 to 3% of the value of the catch. But the agency here showed no such restraint, requiring monitoring on 50% of the trips at a cost of up to 20% of their annual returns. Nonetheless, the court below deferred to the agency because it viewed the statute as silent on the who pays question.
Congress established by law that domestic fishing vessels had to be monitored to ensure they follow the law, but they didn't specifically say who was to pay for the monitoring. The Department of Commerce decided that since Congress didn't say they couldn't make the fishing vessels pay for the monitor's salary, they had the statutory authority to do so. As you would expect, the petitioners disagreed.
There is no justification for giving the tie to the government or conjuring agency authority from silence. Both the APA and constitutional avoidance principles call for de novo review, asking only what's the best reading of the statute. Asking instead, is the statute ambiguous, is fundamentally misguided. The whole point of statutory construction is to bring clarity, not to identify ambiguity.
Both the Administrative Procedures Act, the APA, and the concept of constitutional avoidance, where federal courts should avoid a constitution-based decision when a statutory or regulatory one is available, state that the court review the case de novo, anew, to determine the best understanding of the law, though that is exactly what the Chevron Deference bypasses.
The government defends this practice not as the best reading of the APA, but by invoking stare decisis. That is doubly problematic. First, at issue here is only Chevron's methodology, which is entitled to reduced stare decisis effect. We have no beef with Chevron's Clean Air Act holding, and we could not take issue with its APA holding because it failed to mention that statute. But second, all the traditional stare decisis factors point in favor of overruling Chevron's methodology. The doctrine is unworkable as its critical threshold question of ambiguity is hopelessly ambiguous. It is also a reliance-destroying doctrine because it facilitates agency flip-flopping. So the reality here is the Chevron two-step has to go and should be replaced with only one question: what is the best reading of the statute?